it goes hand in hand with understanding where is it that security can help you actually succeed more with your product. Except for specific products that are very security sensitive, security is probably not a core component of your product market fit. People expect the product to be secure, but they don't necessarily buy it because it's secure once it's above a certain bar. Other products, that again, sometimes you deal with very sensitive things and that's not the case. But for all products, I think the notion of being trustworthy, of demonstrating that you are trustworthy, that you will protect their data, that you will protect your customers is increasingly important.
Hi, you're listening to The Secure Developer. It's part of the DevSecOn community, a platform for developers, operators, and security people to share their views and practices on DevSecOps, Dev and Sec collaboration, cloud security, and more. Check out devsecon.com to join the community and find other great resources. This podcast is sponsored by Snyk. Snyk's developer security platform helps developers build secure applications without slowing down, fixing vulnerabilities in code, open source, containers, and infrastructure as code. To learn more, visit snyk.io/TSD. That's SNYK.io/TSD. On today's episode, Guy Pajani, founder of Snyk, talks to Peter Ehlert, Chief Security Officer at Highspot. Peter leads Highspot's trust strategy, ensuring their customer security. He combines a passion for trustworthy computing with a deep technical expertise honed through more than 15 years of working with some of the largest technology, telecom, and financial companies on their information security practices. Peter's most recently led security engineering for publicly traded Smartsheets, and prior to that, helped lead product security at Facebook. Early in his career, he was vice president of leading security consultancy, ISEC Partners, and worked at Microsoft during the company's formation of the Trustworthy Computing Initiative. We hope you enjoyed their conversation, and don't forget to leave us a review on iTunes if you enjoyed today's episode.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to The Secure Developer. Thanks for tuning back in. Today, we have the pleasure of having a repeat guest with us on the show, which is always fun as we can talk a little bit about what has changed, in between the episodes. And that's Peter Ehlert, who is the Chief Security Officer at Highspot and was previously head of product security at Smartsheet at the previous episodes. Peter, thanks for coming on to the show again.
Guy, thanks a lot for having me. I really appreciate the invitation, and I'm glad to be here. I'm talking to you today.
So, Peter, there's a lot to sort of dig into, and a lot of it would be a little bit on the before and after. So maybe we take a moment a bit and tell us a bit about your journey kind of into and through the security world for context here.
Yeah, absolutely. A day or two ago, I started out as a developer and moved into security at Microsoft, actually, when Microsoft was having security challenges and needing more talented people to look in that space. In fact, I have a few of my colleagues that were also here at Highspot that were at Microsoft back in the day, but you may have noted that the 20th anniversary of the Trustworthy Computing memo happened just a couple of months ago. But it was interesting to think back on where we were 20 years ago when that happened. So, I moved from Microsoft and have been through a number of different companies, kind of growing my security career, moving from an IC to a manager, and have more recently led security engineering and product security teams at Facebook and Smartsheet, ultimately building, towards the kind of top chair, right, to go and lead a security organization. And so here at Highspot, I've stepped into that CISO role for the first time and have really enjoyed it as it's been developing the organization here at the company.
Excellent. So just a little bit for context for people, can you tell us a word about maybe Smartsheet and Highspot? Like what do those businesses do?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure people are familiar with Facebook, but Smartsheet is a company that does kind of workplace automation, right? It's a great set of tools to actually do more ad hoc process automation and process management. So, you have dedicated tools for doing those types of work from, your CRM system or other kind of systems that have very specific workflow. And then there's a big bunch of stuff that you do where you just need to go get things done, but there's not a specific kind of process that you might get through. And Smartsheet is a great tool to help you actually work through that more ad hoc workflow process. So I was at Smartsheet for a couple of years, and then I came over to Highspot just over 2 years ago now. And HighSpot is a sales enablement platform. And so what we do here at HighSpot is we really connect your marketing team to your sales team to make your overall go-to-market organization much more efficient and effective. I sometimes like to think about it in terms of making, your entire sales team as good as your CEO at selling your company. It's really about making a consistent improvement across a lot of different individuals by giving them the right context, the right information when they need it, great metrics to understand how things are working and what things aren't working well, training and coaching to help level up your team and help them understand how to sell better.
Got it. Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
That's great context. And they're both SaaS applications, right? So
Yeah.
SaaS offerings in, I guess, everybody cares about security, but not highly regulated industries.
Yep, that's true. Smartsheet was a little bit more, there were some customers that were more highly regulated. I think HighSpot, being a sales platform, even for our customers that tend to have very conservative views on risk, we still end up being not their highest priority, given that we primarily have here at HighSpot, we deal with, material that's meant to be used to inform your sales team or to send to your actual potential customers. And so it is a little bit less sensitive in terms of the potential nature of the information.
More naturally public kind of information or shareable information. So Peter, I think a lot of the sort of the topic that I'd love to cover is sort of this, you've had this interesting opportunity of going through maybe a slightly similar journey from two different chairs, maybe from the sort of the product security chair and now into the CISO one. Also, a bunch of time has passed. So let's maybe start exploring a little bit the differences. I believe, both Smartsheet, when you joined them, were a little bit under 1,000 people, and HighSpot, sort of similar. Coming into it, maybe let's start with just contrasting the situation. When you joined Smartsheet, what was the sort of security team's status? And more importantly, how does that compare to the HighSpot reality?
Yeah, so Smartsheet had an existing security team that they had had for a number of years. And I think about a year before I got there, their former security leader had departed and the team had kind of dwindled down to, there was just, one person left on the team essentially when I showed up. And so, I kind of came in the door and they'd had a new hire that they hired as well. And so I had, just two people on the team and built out the organization from there to really understand the risks that the product faced and to help them tackle those challenges. But it was interesting in that there had already been a sense of culture created by the previous team going back a number of years. And so some of that was about taking what was there and improving it, making it better. There were kind of some specific places where we needed to kind of do a little bit of a reset and think again about the problem space and about how to engage the product team overall. And so it was a little bit more kind of back and forth in that. And then it was also, a challenging time. I don't know if it's more challenging now, but challenging time to build out a team, right? I think over the past decade and a half of leading security teams, it's always been hard to hire security people, but it just seems to get a little bit harder every year. And then COVID happened. So the team grew a little more slowly than I would like at Smartsheet. I think, comparing that to HighSpot, I think there are some things that are certainly similar about that and some things that are different. At HighSpot, though, there was, a strong engineering culture and an understanding from a lot of engineers who came from other large companies that had been trained in security. So there weren't really big security problems, I think, walking in the door, but there wasn't any existing security team, right? There was never had been a security team. There was some of that security culture that I tend to think about and try to drive, right? To have people be aware and thinking about what it is that they're doing and how it might impact kind of potential risk. All of that was a blank slate. And so it's been a very rewarding opportunity to kind of build out both the organization and build up, the processes and the culture from kind of ground zero. And, we're coming up on 10 people that we have across, a few different areas on the security team here at HighSpot. And it's been a great experience getting kind of some new leaders to come and shepherd some of those areas and pull some talent that was already here in the company together to build a really cohesive team.
So is it easier or harder to establish a security practice when there is an existing security culture or there isn't? Was it an advantage to come into a blank slate or more work?
It's a good question. I think it really is going to depend on the company. One of the things that I've really enjoyed about HighSpot, and it's certainly something that I kind of look for or have in my recent career, is that HighSpot, we get security already, right? Like I've never had to sit and convince anybody across the company from, junior engineers all the way up to our CEO, right? Like the importance of security. That's never been a conversation that we've had to happen. And so I think here at HighSpot, it's been a little bit of an advantage in that the culture that we're establishing, right, is kind of exactly what I envision, right? And success or failure, right? Like it's as a result of kind of what me and the rest of the security team do versus having some legacy that you have to, deal with in some way, right? And sometimes, as I said, sometimes it's about improving existing things and sometimes it's about a little bit more of a reset. I do wonder, and it's not something I would be eager to tackle, but I do wonder if coming into an organization where it was a little bit more of a challenge of like, hey, we're here and security is actually something that you have to think about and is important, if that would be a opportunity where having some pre-existing kind of legacy culture that you were inheriting may be more of an advantage.
It feels like maybe to an extent there's security awareness. Is it right to say, as long as you have a sense of ownership, so probably the folks within the HighSpot team, had the sense of ownership, they had certain competencies, and you have to teach them what a security program is versus maybe, needing to convince people that they should care and they should be responsible. Is that correct?
Yeah. I think that's the good way to think about it. I think, the conversation that I've had over and over again at HighSpot has really been about, hey, we know that this is important, but we don't quite know how it's important or what we should do as a result. And that's it's a much more fun conversation to have, right? To go talk about the details of how to deal with a particular risk or address, a kind of code defect or what frameworks might be available than it is to argue about why security is important at the top level. And so, the folks here know that it's important and they look to me and the rest of the team to provide guidance on how to be kind of highly effective in managing that risk. But we don't argue a lot about whether we have to do something or how important the security risk is. And in fact, HighSpot's kind of a special place. It's even been a little bit too far on the other side, I will say. There's been at least one case where somebody on my team has, been talking with, part of the organization and had kind of an offhanded conversation about, oh, wouldn't it be nice if, this thing were true so that our security would be, like 5% better, only to come back a month later and have the team having been working feverishly to make that happen and realizing that, my whole team has to be very explicit what's required, what we should do, what would be kind of nice to have if it didn't cost a lot, right? So that we can all make good choices about how we spend our resources.
Yeah, that's a first-class problem, though.
Yeah, it is. It's a problem I love to have, I got to say.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess the other change there beyond the culture is you're coming in with a broader purview. How has your kind of steps or sort of, processes or even the program changed when you think about product security, culture of security with engineering versus maybe the encompassing the broader CISO scope? And maybe you can elaborate a little bit about what is within your scope just for.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So, kind of security and some of the compliance risk kind of across the company is really within my scope, right? Even down to, we don't have kind of a lot of fixed offices, but physical security kind of falls under that. It's not something that we have spent a lot of attention on, but, that's part of it as well. I think the kind of the main places that we tend to focus, right, are around certainly our product security as well as our corporate security. And then we have a compliance team, right? And so those are kind of the three legs of the chair, I like to think of them. And it's really about not just helping the product and kind of dealing with all the places that our customer data gets to, but also from a business side, all of the things that our go-to-market team is doing, our G&A teams have lots of processes and sensitive data around employees and people that we have to protect. And so helping manage the systems that we use across all of those things and protect, our people, our data, our processes, et cetera. I think one of the things that has certainly been true as I've moved into this new role, it's been a little bit of a change in the way I think about driving the organization. I think at Smartsheet, I spent a lot of time working on developing the kind of culture of security within the product team. And here at HighSpot, it's been a little bit more of my time is focused on building the security organization that's going to go then focus on building the right culture across the rest of the company. I had the great luck to find just a really amazing director of product security to take essentially my old role. And he's done a fantastic job of really shaping the conversations that we have with our product team here. But he and I talk, a lot about kind of the cultural context that we're trying to espouse. And I've been really grateful to have somebody that I can trust and rely on to do things in a similar fashion that I would approach them.
The move from being kind of closer or frontline manager to maybe like second line manager, I don't know if there's another layer there, there's always a bit of a challenge. What has been kind of hardest to let go of, specifically to your old realm of product security?
Yeah, it's a good question. All of it is stuff that I enjoy, right? Like the thing about my role is I get a lot of visibility and context kind of across the company, and I help, kind of the top level navigation of managing risk. But there's so much about various parts of security that I really enjoy that I miss because I don't get as much opportunity to do that. I will say that it is one of the benefits of growing a team from scratch, though, is that when you start, of course, there was no one on the team, right? I did get a little bit of time to go back and do some of the things that I now don't really have time to do anymore. But I don't know that I could point to one thing, right? Like I enjoy so much about kind of the product security space and about helping with infrastructure and helping with design and threat modeling and just, yeah, it's all fantastic.
That's awesome. That's sort of great to hear. And it's a fair point on sort of growing the team, to an extent in your image, but also kind of having been sort of involved throughout. So you have a certain depth in the materials. So one of the key topics that you mentioned last time in our conversation, which was about 3 years ago now, was on threat modeling, and the importance of it for developers. When you think more broadly now, sort of as a CISO, you think about the organization, how do you kind of threat model, your profile of the company? Does it change your purview on what's important? Does product security kind of come back to the forefront, kind of giving the nature of the product, the nature of the company? How do you think about modeling for the threats in the broader scope?
It's a great question, right? Like I think we talked about, last time, one of the things that I've thought about threat modeling, since the early days at kind of Microsoft, when Microsoft was first trying to roll it out, right? It's like I saw a lot of people kind of being dogmatic, right? And I think even in our last conversation, I maybe said, you can call it a security design review or you can call it a threat model. And sometimes people might have a almost Pavlovian response to the threat modeling idea. Yeah. But at the end of the day, right, it's about a kind of approach to thinking about a problem and analyzing the properties of it, right? And you can do that certainly in all of the product security space. You can do that with other processes and systems as well, right? Like you might not use the exact same technique or necessarily the same tool, if you're creating data flow diagrams, right? Like they might end up looking a little different if you're looking at Workday as a HRIS system to help the HR team. But that type of understanding of what is the information that you're actually protecting and how does it move through these different components, right? And in outside of the product security realm and kind of the corporate security realm, there's also a lot of stuff that goes through processes that are a little more ad hoc, right? Like content might be downloaded to somebody's machine, right? Like even stuff could still be printed out, right? And managed on paper copies, right? And so it changes a little bit of how the information moves around and the different kinds of places that it might be stored. But I think the approach is still a solid way to analyze and understand what a risk might look like for one of those things. So I think the other thing, you asked a little bit about the change in scope and how it affects things. I certainly think that one of the things that's great about, the product security space is you have a pretty good understanding. Usually, development teams tend to know what they've built, right? At least at some level. Now you can have the problem that you have so many different development teams that you have, other problems kind of tracking and managing it. But I think on the corporate side, like looking at the rest of the business, there's a little bit less definition in some of the processes, and there's a little bit more involvement of people kind of making decisions, which can make understanding what might be happening a little bit more challenging. A great example, right, of this actually happened, here a few months ago. It turned out that we had kind of, a process flow that was embedded in a set of software, right, that people were expecting, to go from A to B to C to D. And it turned out that all of the people that were using the software ended up, having somebody in the early days just ended up doing it differently. And so part of the IT team that was building the automation to go from A to B to C to D didn't understand that the people that were actually doing the process were doing it by going, B to C to A to D. And I see that more in kind of the broader business cases, is that the people tend to play a bigger role. And so the way that you think about the problem has to incorporate that in some fashion.
About the challenge being people are less familiar, they're sort of working through the process a little bit more kind of blindly or methodically, or following kind of the dictated set of steps versus a true understanding of what's involved.
Yeah. And so when I look at kind of, the idea of threat modeling, I think that that's one of the things that I think is a little bit more challenging on the corporate side, is that, when we're talking to a product team, you're building a product, and that product is kind of the thing that does all the stuff almost end to end. And sometimes you have some manual processes around, some back-end workflow or something, but even the manual processes tend to be pretty, rigorously dictated. And engineers just think that way, right? But when you work with other folks across other parts of the business, you don't have people that think that way, and you tend to have a lot more ad hoc kind of workflows where people, make choices. And so the way that you look at those data flows has to incorporate some of that, the human factor in a much bigger way.
Yeah, interesting. We had Adrian Ludwig on the show at some point, who is the now Chief Trust Officer at Atlassian. And he made a comment that stayed with me around how we keep talking about enterprise security grade, when really the right threshold is consumer security grade, in which we don't assume people to be sort of smarter than the system. So it's interesting to think about whether those systems, to an extent, like how you're optimizing for these people who are maybe a little bit less savvy in what they're doing, shouldn't actually be applied back to the product and developer approach.
Yeah, I agree with that sentiment, right? Like the people are often kind of the more challenging aspect of any of these systems, right? And it just ends up being that, across the corporate side, there's a lot more people that are a lot more responsible for making a lot more choices.
Yeah. And when you're approaching these other spaces, you come from product security, you're now faced with handling corporate security related issues and physical security for that matter. Do you find you're anchoring in product security practices? Or is it better to sort of go and kind of learn the state of the art in the IT sec space and go over that? What do you find more effective?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that, I don't know that the jury has come back on that one totally. I do tend to, apply the techniques and methods that I have built and grown over my career, which, as you say, right, comes from kind of the software world more than, helping companies all up. But I have also been spending some time learning and understanding a little bit more about, how an IT team at a big company that doesn't do software might approach some things, to understand a little bit better, especially just building some empathy for our IT partners and how they approach problems very differently from, I would say, our product partners. But I do still, I think, tend to think about it from a software kind of product security perspective, even if I do some translating to help engage with other partners who may be less familiar with some of those concepts.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. I find I'm a bit of a firm believer in the sort of softwareizing the world type view. And you definitely see IT teams being increasingly development teams, right? You're seeing a lot of these, Workday and Salesforce and any of these sort of IT systems becoming more software driven themselves, trying to embrace sort of software development processes around how they are configured. So it's interesting to think what's the sort of the cross-pollination eventually. We definitely have seen that with cloud, right? That has turned a lot of IT infrastructure into effectively software.
Yeah. And it is actually, one of the key challenges, I think, in my role is I think a lot of people that are leading security teams across lots of different kinds of businesses is dealing with the cloud, right? Like Highspot is kind of, I describe it as a cloud native company, right? Like it was started in 2012. The first product was built and launched in AWS. Pretty much all of our internal systems, right, are cloud services. We run very little infrastructure or kind of on-prem versions of anything ourselves. And so when I look across systems that aren't, devices, whether they be, laptops or tablets or phones or anything else that are issued to people, right? We here at HighSpot really lack the, server, IDF, colo dimension almost entirely. And it's all about, what's going on with the many, many different cloud services that we have, and the more that, are coming up kind of every day.
Yeah, interesting. So shifting gears a little bit, you've kind of moved from this product security to CISO reality. What was the sort of the biggest surprise, or like something you thought you knew, but coming into the role you didn't? And maybe I'll kind of bundle in a related question, which is, what do you wish you knew, or could have prepared for coming into the role?
That's a good question. I think the thing that was maybe the biggest surprise was just building the effective bridges and the collaboration with a broader set of audiences, right? Like some of the ways in which, let me take a step back actually, right? Like even before, I would say that the security teams that I've built have always been more about partnering with, collaborators or collaborating with partners maybe across, the teams that have these risks and helping them understand and guide them and drive them to create better outcomes, right? It's about that deep collaboration. I think that there's, a different model where you actually have security teams that do, write more code and actually go implement frameworks or systems to go do the things themselves rather than trying to engage with maybe a product team to get the product team to go and implement that. And I've always been kind of more on the building a collaboration kind of side. And so I was really thinking that I was ready to go and better, apply that same kind of model with a wider set of collaboration partners. And what I found is that, some of the techniques don't translate, right? Like some of the ways that we approach that collaboration don't work as well. And also just working with a broader diversity of personality types and people with different objectives, right? When we go work with HR, for example, right? Like I don't work with a lot of engineers in HR, of course. They tend to have a very different way that they approach processes and systems and how they do their work. And a lot of it in being a good collaborator and helping drive and navigate the risk for the company is about me and my organization adapting to how our various partners around the company are doing things and helping them create a solution, again, that's going to work for them. Kind of going back to the process automation example, right? Like we can build all the technology that we want, but if the team doesn't actually use it, right, then it hasn't actually moved the needle at all. And so we really have to engage with those partners on their turf, on their terms, and help them figure out how to really protect themselves and protect the company.
Yeah, and what has worked to address it? So like you mentioned an example of maybe understanding the process. I'll sort of say sometimes developers do sort of a similar sets of sort of quirky things, especially when it comes to sort of, Git rebases and things of that nature. But what are some examples of things that have like learnings, things that you've sort of adapted or changed?
Yeah, so I think one of the things is really just making sure that we are doing good, solid, and really open conversations about what it is that we're trying to achieve and how it is that we're going about that. And honestly, it's been a unique challenge, I think, in my career, having started at a company post kind of COVID lockdown and having not met so many of my coworkers for such a long period of time, right? Like it was a whole year before I sat down and met a bunch of folks that were in senior leadership positions that I Zoom with all the time, but actually seeing them in person took a really long time. And so I would say that it's been harder, right, to have that kind of open dialogue in a way that everybody kind of can understand each other effectively. But I think really starting with that question of what is it that you're trying to do and what is it that I'm trying to do and how are we going about that? Because I find that type of understanding builds the empathy for the teams to be better collaborators when they're working on something. And so I've come back to kind of these more human-based skills about how to partner with these different organizations and how to drive kind of effective processes as a result of the partnering with the people, not with the organization.
Yeah, interesting. And I guess, is there anything you could have done ahead of time to be better prepared for this? Like if you were, forget for a sec, the sort of your team is around, you're in the situation of you're hiring a CISO, you have someone who is, just like the experience Peter had from Smartsheet, you have two candidates, one has exactly what you've had and one has something else, what else would you think would sort of set up for success in that transition?
Yeah, that's a good question. Ultimately, I think if you're going to use a strategy like the one that we've employed here at HighSpot, which is really about building a security team that's going to partner with the organization at large, right? And building those partnerships, I think having some demonstrated actual examples of partnering with a more diverse set of stakeholders would be an interesting thing to look at in a potential candidate. I think on the other side, maybe a slight twist on your question, which is like, if somebody were walking into a CISO role, and what might you suggest for them to try to work on, things that they will likely need as they're coming up to speed? I would, really recommend that people either in whatever form they're kind of comfortable with, right? Like going and doing a little bit more thinking and learning about building those collaborative experiences, right? There's lots of great books and courses on that stuff. It's something that I ended up doing a little bit a few months after I got here, but I definitely wish that I had spent a little more focus and time as I was first entering the organization to think more deeply about the people dimension, where I didn't have as much kind of shared history, right, as I do with, another engineer, given kind of my background. I think, one of the other conversations that I had with our CEO, right, Robert Wabi, was really about what kind of CISO or security leader that you want, kind of, just putting titles aside, because I know there's a bunch of those, but I certainly advocate for the idea that having somebody like me who has some engineering background and has technical acumen and capability, I think leads to better outcomes, especially for a company that's kind of our size. I think, when you're getting to a company that has a security team of, dozens or hundreds of people, you probably need to optimize or index a little bit more for somebody with a lot of organizational capability over potential technical capability. But I would say that in the 2 years that I've been here, I think it's played out kind of over and over again that I think if I were to ask Robert today, he would say that they were absolutely right in picking a technical candidate because they were talking to some other candidates that weren't, and that it's really helped out in a wide variety of ways where it's not just about helping guide the organization, but it's also, there's a lot of it that's about even teaching, right? Teaching the other leaders about how to think about these risks, teaching the other leaders about how to address or why something needs to really be focused on or prioritized. And those teaching moments are dramatically easier when you have a depth of technical understanding kind of going, all the way down than if you're really more focused on how to build the organization.
Yeah, interesting. I guess at the risk of maybe getting the same answer around the people, what about the other way around? So now that you're sort of a CISO, if you're looking back at if you were to sort of run product security, is there anything you take back from this broader learning now that you would do differently in product security?
It's a good question. I haven't thought about that direction as much, I got to say. So I'm not sure I have a great answer. I do think that it is useful to have kind of the holistic model. I think it's one of the challenges that I certainly have in looking at security all up across the company, product and corporate alike, along with compliance, which we haven't also talked a lot about, but getting the kind of super big picture view, right, from 10,000 feet to make sure that you're not over optimizing and really spending all of your resources on the problems that you know about versus the ones that you don't. I think that kind of global thinking probably applies no matter what scope or perspective that you're coming from, right? Like if you're driving a particular feature team, right, understanding the overall risk for the whole feature, the risks that you kind of understand and the ones that you're not quite sure about, that level of global is helpful. I think if you're, leading a product security team and you're looking at the product all up, there's a tendency, we get great tools like Snyk, right, that can show us a problem that we understand and we know how to go tackle. And we can spend a lot of time going and focusing on that problem and driving those numbers down to mitigate risk. And that's great. But is that actually, globally speaking, right, given all of your risk, the most important risk for you to be addressing? And if you don't have that kind of global thinking to be looking out for the things that you know about and the ones that there might be some risk, but you haven't actually spent the time to even go figure out what the risk is, it's just really important to balance your approach so that you're not only focused on the things that you understand.
Yeah, I mean, I think that makes sense and it's good guidance. I am curious to your point around people making mistakes, that maybe there is a bit of a different facet of product security learning to come here that has to do with your customers, right? And your user security. You might be a bit more sensitive to trying to kind of keep your customers from doing, B, C, D, A as part of the processes that your own product kind of gives them to offer if that opens up a security concern.
Yeah, I certainly, in terms of product design, it's been an interesting partnership actually working with our product management team and helping them think more about security. Highspot continues to kind of move up market in terms of tackling bigger enterprises that have more demanding kind of security and compliance requirements. And so really helping the product management team, partnering with them to help them understand and have empathy for the customer's requirements around, like when an IT team vets Highspot, right? What are they thinking about and what are the types of controls that they want to have? And when we're building features, that somebody has to make a security choice, right? Like, what's the value in having the end user make that choice versus making kind of a good choice on their behalf, and really thinking deeply about those problems. I certainly see that there's a connection to kind of some of what I've been working on in terms of collaborating with different folks. But I would also say that I think that even before, I came into this role and had some of the, challenges of working with other teams that work very differently than a product team, I think that I spent a lot of time focused on how, end users are going to do things. And honestly, I think some of that goes back to, Facebook, right? With such a massive company that impacted so many people for so much time on an ongoing basis, there was a lot of focus in, the years that I was there on making sure that everybody from, developers to end users to partners, right? Like could, as they say, fall into the pit of success, right? Like we wanted to make sure that whenever possible, the best choices were made, and that, if you just did the normal thing, you would be on the happy path. And if you did the abnormal thing, then somebody would get notified so that they could help you make sure you stay on the happy path.
Oh, that's awesome. I haven't heard the pit of success, but it sounds similar to the paved road and the secure by default and the sort of making security easy.
I'm trying to remember who it is. There's somebody from Microsoft it was one of the Visual Studio teams, years ago, that would always talk about falling into the pit of success.
Yeah, that's it's a good phrase for it.
Yeah.
Maybe one more question before we kind of close off with the typical closing. What would you say when you look at the industry? So 3 years have passed, fine, you're also in the CISO seat versus product security. But when you look at concerns, even still within the product security realm from 3 years ago to today, has any of that kind of increased or decreased in your mind?
I think one of the things that I see, and maybe I probably am more exposed to it having come from a couple of SaaS companies that themselves used a lot of SaaS products, right? Like the interdependency between all of the different, technology systems that are operated by these different companies, and even the companies and agreements themselves, I think is, a really big weak point in the industry kind of all up, right? And the connections are definitely a place that can be attacked. I think if we look at, and I'm blanking on the name of the hacker group, right? But Okta and Microsoft were both recently breached to some degree, and they were attacked through their suppliers, right? They were attacked through their supply chain, and not in terms of dependencies, but actually through the systems and processes that their suppliers use to work with them. I don't think that's, the last we're going to hear of that type of attack, right? And when you looked at the actual tactics and techniques of the hacker group, they were specifically targeting those suppliers because they knew that they were the road into some of these large companies and organizations, right? They went after telecom, they went after staffing agencies, they went after these companies that all these massive companies that are ultimately their real targets use and leverage to do their business.
Yeah, absolutely. It was Lapsus.
Lapsus, thank you. Yeah,
the company. And it's a supply chain. You're talking about a sort of a supply chain risk, but not in the context of open source components necessarily, but rather in the context of the services that you consume.
Yeah, again, it goes back to the people, right? Like the people at those companies also, have risks for them, and how well are those companies protecting, how well are my vendors' companies protecting their employees from risks to me?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I might have sort of been teeing up a little bit, but one closing question. This has been a great conversation. We can probably kind of geek out here for another extra hour. I think we're about out of time. One, my kind of open-ended question at the end of every episode: if you had unlimited budget and unlimited resources to tackle a problem in the security space, what would that be? And if you have kind of a sense of it, which direction you would take?
Yeah, it's a good question, right? I do look at these interdependencies more and more, right? Like the problem that I just talked about from the Lapsus group, I think is a problem that we're going to have to grapple with in some meaningful way, more than, the vendor security review process that we all go through as we trade back these forms, of 300 questions about, do you do this and that, right? Like, I think another one that I think about in that space a little bit, I don't remember who it was on Twitter, noted, during when it was discovered that Zoom's encryption, right, a couple of years ago wasn't up to snuff, right? The question was, we have all of these massive companies that are using Zoom, like whose vendor security review caught this vulnerability, right? The answer is none. There was no vendor security risk management program that I think effectively identified that kind of a risk in a company, and yet it still has a tremendous impact. And so thinking about how do we build these interconnected dependencies, all of these systems, across companies in a way that we can understand what the risk is and deal effectively with it and mitigate it, I think is a real challenge that we're all as an industry going to have to tackle, because this is definitely the direction that everybody is moving. I think, in terms of how I might approach it, it's a really good question, right? Like, I think it's a hard nut to crack because it's predicated a little bit on information asymmetry, right? And of course, your vendor doesn't necessarily want you to know about all of the risks that they have, even though, for you as a consumer of that system, like you need to be able to understand those risks and factor them into how you're managing risk overall. And so I think the information asymmetry piece is one of the hardest pieces to deal with. And I think that almost is what you have to tackle a little bit more directly, either through some kind of mandate or building enough clout behind some type of movement that will actually, get companies to go do this thing, that's to share information about these risks in a way that's meaningful, that maybe they don't always see as in line with their best outcome.
Yeah, and hopefully that transparency, I think there's some interesting work happening around software supply chain security, even if it's on a little bit the sort of the kind of open source consumption side. Primarily, It does have federal government kind of requesting that you actually provide some form of attestation, some form of yes, it's an SBOM and sort of software bill of materials, but it can be expanded into statements about what has been done to that. Has it been vetted? Has it been secured? Which I'm sure compliance would always. You can always check the box without doing the security, but hopefully it drives at least some transparency in the process.
I see some companies, right? Like, I think if you think about Snyk, right? Like, I love Snyk a lot, right? It's a fantastic product. It does a great job of looking at, your libraries and dependencies, identifying open source and everything else, right? Like, I guess the question is, where's the Snyk for service endpoints, right? Like, where's the tool that will show me, given the 30 web services that we call, right? Like, which ones are kind of problematic. And then, the version past that is like, okay, forget web services and, kind of software talking to software. What about, companies talking to companies? And so, there's some stuff like Security Scorecard, which I'm not a huge fan of, I would say, but I think that they're trying to understand a little bit about how to measure, understand risk of a given kind of organization. And that's at the heart of what we need to solve as an industry. Yeah.
Like an important problem to solve. So definitely a great one. Peter, thanks for coming on. Great insights from your journey. Thanks for sharing here.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks a lot, Guy.
And thanks everybody for tuning in. And I hope you join us for the next one.
Thanks for listening to The Secure Developer. That's all we have time for today. To find additional episodes and full transcriptions, visit thesecuredeveloper.com. If you'd like to be a guest on the show or get involved in the community, find us on Twitter at @DevSecCon. Don't forget to leave us a review on iTunes if you enjoyed today's episode. Bye for now.